Hey guys, today on JD Cars we're going to be replacing the clutch and swapping it out with a Vallejo single mass flywheel conversion on this BMW 328i. So the clutch on this car has been worn out for quite a while and it's just barely hanging on by its last legs. So before school starts up next week, I want to tackle this job and get it done. I'm going to be doing this in my home garage on the MaxJax lift. I did a full 20-minute install video on the lift if you're interested in that, where I go into a ton of detail about it. So if you're interested, be sure to check that out. So I'm going to get this thing up in the air and we'll jump into it. Alright, car's up in the air, and I printed out a couple write-ups on this repair just to have some nice reference while we're working on the car. I'll give you a rundown of the tools that we'll be needing. Preferably you want a 2-post lift like I'm working on, air impact tools or electric impact tools, a floor jack, and a 2x4 to lift up to the front of the engine. My 2x4 for my personal situation needs to be 39 inches, a transmission jack, extension bars of numerous different sizes, female torque sets, numerous different socket sizes, male torque sets, Allen socket sets. You don't need exhaust hanger pliers, but it can be helpful. A torque wrench, pry bars, hacksaw, hammer, flashlights, drop lights, penetrating oil, and electrical tape. So we'll begin by removing numerous 8 and 10 millimeter screws holding on the splash guard and the front bumper cover. And drop that down and get it out of the way. Alright, so removing those splash guards exposes the engine and the transmission here, and you do have 2 splash guards on either side as well, which kind of interfere with the removal of this splash guard here, which we're going to need to remove to take out the drive line. My jack is kind of interfering with removing these entirely, but I did remove the 10 millimeter plastic nuts and the 8 millimeter screws, which is going to give us plenty of access to get in here and unbolt the metal heat shield and splash shield to get it out of the way. Now, something I highly suggest doing whenever doing a highly in-depth repair like this, grab some cups and some stickies, organize your hardware somehow. I've got my splash guard and bumper cover screws and nuts all inside this cup here. I'm going to do this for all the hardware that I take off the car, just to keep everything organized, because it's one thing doing a small repair to remember where hardware goes, but when we're pulling off hundreds of bolts like this, it is important to organize everything. So just a quick note here, guys, because of how massive a repair this is, I'm not going to be doing a ton of the creative vlog style editing in this video. This is strictly going to be an informative tutorial style video, just to keep the length and editing work down to a minimum. Once I start doing those vlog style montages of me unbolting stuff and whatnot, it becomes a lot more editing work, and it would probably end up being a 40 or 50 minute video. So I'm just going to keep it down to the instructions here and everything you need to know to complete the repair. So after removing the splash shields, it's time to remove the exhaust. Starting with this stiffening plate in the middle here, we'll have to remove 8 T50 torque screws. Next, grab your 8 millimeter and come to the rear of the car to remove this plastic access panel right here to allow the exhaust to drop down. Next, you'll need to support your muffler from underneath because it is quite heavy. And once we release the exhaust, it's going to want to come down. So it's a good idea to secure the exhaust underneath the muffler here. And releasing the rear of the exhaust, we have 3 exhaust hangers. First one here, you can remove the hanger hardware to avoid prying it off, but I didn't find prying it off too difficult. So I pried this hanger off. There's a hanger on the front of the muffler here. I'm just gonna remove this nut, I believe it's a 13 millimeter. That'll allow us to drop that down very easily. Lastly, in the very rear of the muffler, there's one more hanger. This is an E10 torque screw. Unfortunately, mine's stripped, so I can't just remove it. I didn't have too much trouble prying off the hanger. I'll leave the center one on for last because that's easiest to do in my opinion. So before we drop the rear of the exhaust, it's a good idea to release our flange bolts in preparation to drop the exhaust. As you can see, mine have quite a bit of rust on them, so this isn't gonna be too fun. Oh, that was an absolute nightmare, but I managed to get the exhaust off the car here. As you can see, I have a mountain of rust underneath the flanges here. Only one of the bolts released easily, 2 of them snapped off, and I had to cut one of them with the angle grinder and a cutting disc. So I'll be replacing all of that hardware, and I'll be sure to apply proper anti-seize to the fittings once I apply them to prevent this from happening in the future. The next step here is going to be removing the center drive line, and in order to do so we have to remove a lot of this heat shielding and splash guards. We'll be needing a combination of 8, 10, and 13 millimeter sockets to remove these shields here, and once we do we'll gain access to the center drive shaft here. One step of the exhaust removal that I forgot to mention is removing an E10 bolt right here. It secures into this bracket, which we'll now be removing using a 13 millimeter and an E10 female torque socket. Now you'll also need to remove the splash shield bracket. Unfortunately, my 10 millimeter nut on there was extremely seized. I could not get it off by any means, so I had to bend the bracket out of the way here. Obviously that's not what I would prefer to do, but what I had to do. So moving on, we're gonna remove the drive shaft by removing a couple 18 millimeter bolts and nuts. I'm just gonna start off by removing the 3 that actually hold it to the transmission. Then we'll deal with assessing whether or not this needs to be replaced. If that is the case, we'll replace it. In addition to removing these 3 18 millimeter bolts, we have to come back here to the center of the drive shaft, and to release the drive shaft we'll have to remove the center bearing by removing these 2 13 millimeter bolts. At this point we're very close to dropping the transmission from the car, but there are a couple things we need to take care of first, including disconnecting the reverse gear switch connector and the 2 oxygen sensor connectors here. Both are quick release connectors and you don't need any special tools to take care of those. Additionally, we need to remove the shift rod here, which involves removing 2 clips. As you can see, there's one here and one up front. Both can be removed using some needle nose pliers and or a flathead. After removing the shift rod itself, we need to remove the shift rod bracket. Similar process as before. It has 2 clips up at the front. You can see one on the left there and one on the right. This is one clip. This is the other. You can release those with a flathead screwdriver and pull them out to release the bracket. After disconnecting your O2 sensors, you'll want to remove 2 E10 torque screws with a female torque socket, which is going to release this entire bracket here that was previously holding your O2 sensors. And they also double as bell housing bolts if you're curious about that. All right, once we've disconnected our O2 sensors, reverse light switch, and removed the bracket, and we've now removed our shift linkage and shift linkage bracket slider bolts right here. And we can now remove 2 13 millimeter nuts that are retaining the slave cylinder here. You can see one 13 millimeter nut on the bottom and there's another one on the top. Probably going to use a combination of extensions and a socket to remove those. This will release the slave cylinder. As you can see, it's loose here. Pull it out and remove it. It takes a little bit of finessing to get it out there. And I'm probably going to grab a wire or something just to hold this up out of the way so it doesn't get damaged. Also at this point, not that you're going to be up in the car while it's on the lift, but I just have to say this, be sure you don't press your clutch pedal. If you do, you're gonna cause some serious damage and probably end up with hydraulic failure of your slave cylinder here. I also forgot to mention that we need to remove our O2 sensor bracket by removing this 13 millimeter bolt right here. All right, so at this point, it's now time to drop the transmission out of the car. However, my low ceilings and my current lift setup presents a bit of an issue with removing the transmission. It's just too low that a high lift transmission jack won't fit underneath the car here. Obviously too high to use a low lift transmission jack because, well, it's about 4 feet off the ground here. So I just ran to Home Depot a little while ago, picked up a whole bunch of cinder blocks here. I measured the lifting height of this to be 20 inches at the highest point that I would feel comfortable at, and the distance is approximately 48 inches. That left me with 28 inches of room that I had to fill. So I'm gonna put 1 block on each corner of the lift. 3 times 8, 24, plus 4, 28. That's how I arrived at this number of cinder blocks. So I'm gonna move those under here and we'll see how it works out. Alright, so got my makeshift transmission jack set up here. As you can see, 3 8x8 cinder blocks on each corner and then 1 4x8 on the top. Should have about 20 inches between the top of the concrete here and the transmission, which will leave us plenty of room to pull it down and work on it. So I'm gonna raise up this jack here throw some ratchet straps around the transmission and get it nicely secured, and then we'll begin removing it. Now with our jack supporting our transmission, we can remove the transmission bracket here using a 13mm socket to remove the bolts around the perimeter of the bracket here. A 13mm also fits the rubber isolator bolts right here to disconnect the bracket from the transmission itself. Now with the transmission support bracket removed and the jack supporting the transmission, we can now unbolt the transmission from the engine, beginning with this E12 female Torx bolt right here on the left. The transmission has 5 aluminum bolts that we won't be reusing, and it has 5 steel bolts that we will be reusing. Make sure to replace the aluminum bolts, they cannot be reused. Next we'll be removing an E14 Torx bolt on the top of the bell housing, at the very top at the 12 o'clock position here. In order to gain better access, we're going to be using a floor jack and a 2x4 to press up on the front of the engine to tilt the transmission back a bit to gain better access to that bolt. Now in order to do so, we are going to have to lower our transmission jack a bit to allow it to come down. So using this floor jack and 2x4 worked beautifully to drop the transmission down. My best to show you here, up at the top of the transmission, see if we can get in there. Sorry to tilt the camera, but you can just barely see that E14 bolt up at the top of the bell housing. So we're gonna pull that out and then we'll proceed with unbolting transmission. After removing the top bolt at the 12 o'clock position, we're gonna be removing 2 steel E14 bolts, one at the 1 o'clock and one at the 2 o'clock position. After removing the 1 o'clock and 2 o'clock position bolts, we're going to remove 4 steel bolts with an E18 Torx socket. 2 are located on the upper left here. You can see just behind the ratchet strap. See them right there. And then we have 2 on the opposite side on the bottom right. So we're going to go ahead and remove those now. After removing these bolts, at this point the transmission is now free from the car. So we can slide it back and lower it down to gain access to our clutch and flywheel. Do be careful when you're dropping your transmission and do so slowly. I did completely forget to pull out these 2 bolts to release this bracket. And we also have to pull off this wire from the top of the transmission here. Just unclip it. Of course it's under our ratchet strap in the front there, but we have another clip over here. Unplug it, and I should be able to get this underneath that ratchet strap, but anyways, you get the point. Just be careful when you're lowering it. Make sure you're not pulling anything or ripping any wires out. Holy cow, I dropped the transmission out of my car. This is such a big relief. I was honestly hugely overwhelmed by this project, but now that I'm about halfway done here, I do feel more comfortable. Obviously, we still have to pull off all the clutch components, flywheel and whatnot, but I do feel very accomplished having the transmission out here. Probably gonna call it here for the day and come back to it tomorrow. It's about dinner time now. I don't really want to dive into removing the pressure plate or the flywheel or anything. So I'm happy with the progress we made today. I'll catch you guys tomorrow. Alrighty, next day here. As you can see, I got the transmission out of the way, so we have more space to work here. You can also see on the left of the flywheel here, I've installed a flywheel lock, which is just an angled piece of metal that I cut out, and it happened to have a hole that fit the right size for the flywheel. You're just going to need to install something to lock the flywheel from moving while we're removing all of these bolts and torquing them down when reinstalling the flywheel. So we'll now be removing the pressure plate here, and to do so we have to remove 6 6mm Allen head bolts all the way around the perimeter. Alright, so just pulled off the clutch. As you can see, the flywheel isn't in tremendously bad shape. I am glad we're replacing it because, as you can see, the dual mass setup has a lot of play in it, and that can make the transmission feel quite sloppy and not as responsive. So I am really excited to be converting this to a single mass flywheel. And then, as you can see, here's our clutch. Nothing crazy going on with the clutch. As you can see here, it is quite worn, but obviously nothing catastrophic here, but it is good we're replacing it. So now that we have the pressure plate and clutch plate off, we can now remove the flywheel by removing 6 T60 Torx screws around the inside perimeter here. So once we removed these 6 T60 Torx screws, the flywheel should be able to come off. As you can see, just moving mine back and forth. I'm not gonna have to do much prying to get it off. It appears it'll come off of the crankshaft quite easily, but if it's not gonna come off easily, you can always pry behind and manipulate the flywheel to come off. Alright, so we've now got the clutch, pressure plate, and flywheel removed from the vehicle, and we're officially halfway done with the job. Now we just have to reverse the entire process. We still have a lot of work ahead of us. I'm gonna go grab the new clutch box and we're gonna tear that open and see what we got, because I still haven't taken a look at it. Also, a quick note before we dive into the new clutch. At this point, you do want to very carefully inspect your main rear seal. You want to look around the edge and just inspect the condition of the rubber. If you see any leaks or tears in the gasket, it is a good idea to replace the seal. I've inspected mine. It's honestly not necessary to replace the seal. And if it's not necessary, you should not take the risk, because when replacing it, there is a 50-50 chance that the seal could develop a leak after replacement. All right, so here are all of our old components here, and here's what we're gonna receive in our Vallejo kit. New flywheel, of course, new pressure plate, new clutch, 2 bearings. We have new flywheel bolts that are just traditional hex head bolts instead of Torx bolts. So we'll be installing these just because I'm gonna use the included hardware to make sure everything's sound. There were supposed to be 6 pressure plate Allen head bolts, but there were only 5. There were numerous holes in the box, and I think one of them got lost during shipping, so I'm just gonna use one of the old ones to replace that. We also have some spline lubricant for reinstalling the transmission. I did also receive from Bavarian Autosport numerous pieces of hardware that we're gonna be replacing, such as aluminum bolts, 2 exhaust gaskets. While we're doing this job, it's a good idea to replace the drive shaft flex disc. They did include 6 new T60 Torx screws for the flywheel, but as I said, I'll be using the Vallejo hardware. We have 5 new flex disc nuts, 2 new transmission rubber isolators, shift linkage seal, and 2 other seals here. They also did include a new rear crankshaft seal, but I won't be replacing that, as I said earlier. So that's a rundown of all the hardware and parts that we'll be reinstalling here. I'm gonna start off by installing the new flywheel. We're gonna take our new flywheel, lift it up and install it on the crankshaft, line up our holes, then we'll install our new flywheel hardware included in the Vallejo kit. Now we'll install our 6 19mm hex head bolts on the flywheel. So I've got all the hex head bolts just finger tighten here. And tightening and torquing them down, you're gonna wanna torque them down in a cross pattern. So for example, we'll start on this one, skip a bolt to the right, go to this one, skip a bolt, go to the right. And because we have an even number of bolts here, if you just continue to do that, you wouldn't torque them all down. So the pattern here is gonna be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So a quick note before tightening these down, as you can see, I've reinstalled my flywheel lock just to prevent the flywheel from moving while we're torquing these down. Once you've tightened these down with your impact, grab a torque wrench, torque them down to 65 foot-pounds using your 19mm. Now that our flywheel is installed and torqued down, we're going to install our clutch plate and pressure plate using the clutch alignment tool and the 6 6mm Allen head bolts. When installing your clutch plate, be sure the gear side, labeled gear side here, is facing the transmission, and the unlabeled side is facing the engine. And we now install our pressure plate on the flywheel dowels. With the pressure plate installed, we can now center the clutch plate and then install our 6 6mm Allen head bolts. Now when torquing down the pressure plate bolts, we're going to apply the same pattern as the flywheel. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Also, the pressure plate only needs to be torqued down to 11 foot-pounds. Once you've torqued down your pressure plate, we can now remove clutch plate alignment tool. At this point, all of the engine-mounted clutch components have been replaced, and we can remove the flywheel locking tool and move on to working on the transmission itself. So coming over to the transmission here, we're now going to be replacing the release bearing, also known as the throwout bearing. So to remove it, we'll pull out the clutch lever and press out on these 2 springs to release it, like so. And we can now pull the bearing out. Good idea to clean this as well as the inside of the bell housing using some brake cleaner. So further inspecting the throwout bearing here, it's a really good thing we're replacing it, because if you take a look, this bearing has just completely failed. It's not supposed to move like that. So this bearing is shot. As you can see, the new bearing obviously does not move back and forth because it's not supposed to, but it's a good thing we're replacing this. Now some additional transmission maintenance. You can remove 4 10mm bolts right here to remove this guard, which will expose a transmission seal right here. As you can see, mine is surprisingly spotless and doesn't show any signs of needing replacement, so I'm going to leave it alone. If this bearing has deteriorated, it is a good idea to replace it. So we'll take our new throwout bearing, snap into place on the clutch lever, and then we can reinstall the clutch lever like so. And the transmission's all set to reinstall in the vehicle. Now, when reinstalling the transmission, it can be exceedingly difficult to line it up. So I've cut the heads off of two of our old E18 Torx bolts. I'm gonna screw these just a couple turns into the engine block, and that's gonna help us line up the transmission when reinstalling it. So as you can see, I installed the guide bolts in this lower right position here where there was already a dowel, and up in the upper left position here where there is also a guide dowel. So now I'm going to reassemble my cinder block and jack assembly here with our transmission, and then we'll raise it up and begin bolting it back into place. All right, after a whole lot of manhandling, finally got the transmission back up there. Now it's time to raise it up and guide it into place, which might be a bit difficult. It can be exceedingly challenging to get this spline shaft to line up with the clutch plate and the pilot bearing, so we'll see how that goes. Almost forgot, we need to replace the transmission rubber isolators right here. It's pretty simple, just grab a 13mm socket, remove the top nut, and replace it with a new one. One other thing before we get started here, we're gonna apply the included Vallejo lubricant. So you can see this is spline lubricant. We're gonna apply that to the transmission spline to hopefully make this as smooth as possible. Whoo-wee, okay. So finally got this lined up, as you can see, nice and flush. Can't really show you this side. I'll come around to the other side. As you can see, got the transmission lined up. Need to pull it a little closer on this side, but got the main important part lined up, which is the spline shaft, and got the pilot bearing lined up with that. I'm really excited about that. I was a bit worried because this setup, as you can imagine, is not easy to move the transmission on because it does not have wheels. But after making many small adjustments to the height and the angle, I was able to slide it on. So now we'll proceed with bolting the transmission into place. So before removing our guide pins, we're going to install a new E18 Torx bolt above it in the upper left hole right there. And we'll do the same on the right side. We'll install a new aluminum E18 bolt above the guide pin. Snug them up, don't torque them down just yet. To assist with holding your bolt on your extension, you can place some masking tape inside your Torx socket to create some friction and hold the bolt in place. Once you've installed those two E18 bolts, we can now slowly lower the jack and jack up the front of the engine once again to gain access to that top bolt on the bell housing. I really can't stress jacking up the front of your engine enough. That step is absolutely crucial. I'll try to show you here. It's pretty easy to see. Jacking up the front of the engine gives you a ton of room and a lot better access to the top bolt on the transmission, which we'll be reinstalling now. That top bolt there is an E14 Torx bolt. So I just installed that top bolt in the 1 o'clock position. Now I'm going to install this E14 in the 12 o'clock position. All right, so we just installed that E14 aluminum bolt at the 12 o'clock position. We have the 1 o'clock steel E14 installed, and now we're going to install a steel E14 in the 2 o'clock position. At this point, we'll now remove the two guide bolts, one on the left side here, and the one on the right side that we installed right there. After removing the guide pins and replacing them with the proper new E18 aluminum bolts, we can now install this left E12 steel bell housing bolt. We're going to leave the two bottom holes open until we reattach the O2 sensor bracket later on. Now with all transmission bell housing bolts installed, we're going to torque the E18 bolts to 73 foot-pounds, and we'll torque the E14 bolts to 52 foot-pounds. We can now release the floor jack and the 2x4 to tilt the transmission back up into place. Now with your transmission jack at the proper height, we can reinstall the transmission support bracket, and we need to reinstall 4 13mm bolts and 2 13mm nuts. The transmission support bracket reinstalled, we can get this jack and all these cinder blocks out of the way. All right, now with all that nonsense out of the way, we have a lot more room to work here. I'm going to begin reassembling the transmission by reattaching our slave cylinder here. You're gonna have to press it down to compress it and reinstall the 2 13mm nuts. Now with the slave cylinder reinstalled, I'm gonna reinstall the O2 sensor bracket right here on the bell housing using our 2 steel E12 bolts. Now that we have the bracket reinstalled, we can plug our O2 sensors back in. Because they are identical connectors, in case you didn't take note before removing them, the green one goes to the far left connector over here, and the yellow one goes to the middle connector. In addition to reconnecting our O2 sensors, we'll connect this switch on the bottom of the oil pan, as well as this connector up here on the back of the transmission. We'll now reinstall the 2 pins on either side of the shift rod bracket to resecure that, and then we'll reinstall the shift rod itself and the 2 C-clips that go on either side. Also, don't forget to reinstall this O2 sensor wire bracket up here. It goes into place like so and is secured with a 13mm bolt. So the transmission itself here is all buttoned up, and before I reinstall my drive shaft here, I am going to replace the flex disc because this one is showing some signs of wear, and while we have it out, I might as well replace it. So if you're replacing yours, these are just 18mm bolts all the way around. I'm also going to be replacing the nuts all the way around. Unfortunately, I couldn't film it because I had my hands full with the drive line, but you need to reinstall the drive shaft center bearing here with the 2 13mm bolts. Make sure it's oriented with the larger half of the circle above the drive shaft. Now on this end, we'll reinstall our 18mm bolts and 18mm nuts, so we'll tighten and torque those down. Alright, so at this point, all the transmission work is complete. All that's left now is reinstalling the exhaust and all the splash shields. So that's pretty straightforward, it's just the reverse process as before. I'm not going to show that just to save time. I will note, however, that I am replacing both exhaust gaskets and the exhaust flange hardware, because as I said earlier, the previous hardware was extremely corroded and only 1 out of the 4 bolts remained, so it's definitely time to replace that. I'll check in once I'm done reinstalling the exhaust and splash guards. Alright guys, so I just got back from testing out the clutch, and oh my god, that made such a big difference in the clutch feel. From the moment I hopped in the car, I noticed it had a much stiffer clutch feel, and it was a much more constant feel throughout the pedal. And the clutch actually engages within the first half to 3/4 of an inch of releasing it, and it engages smoothly throughout the entire clutch release, which is phenomenal. I also noticed right away the difference in the single mass flywheel versus the dual mass that comes OEM in these cars. The single mass flywheel provides a much more responsive throttle feel. It also eliminates almost all slop in the transmission. When you let off the throttle, the car doesn't lurch, and when you give it throttle in low gears, there isn't any noticeable play. It's a very tight, well-made system. So I'm very excited and proud to have completed this job successfully with no issues, knock on wood. I hope if you're doing a clutch job yourself, you found this video helpful, and if you're looking to do a clutch job, I hope this gives you the confidence to do so. I was certainly initially overwhelmed by the thought of dropping the transmission out of my car and pulling everything apart, but I put my fears behind me and just got started with it, and taking it step by step, it really isn't that difficult. I didn't even have a transmission jack and I was able to complete the job. So that wraps up this video. I'd like to pay a huge thank you to Bavarian Autosport for making this video possible. Bavarian Autosport carries almost any and every part you could need for your BMW. They have a wide range of Vallejo products, which is what I installed in this car today. So if you need anything at all for your BMW, be sure to check out Bavarian Autosport at bavauto.com. Thanks for watching, guys. Please leave a like below and subscribe if you've yet to do so, and I'll see you next time on JD Cars.